Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the show. So, I did a video yesterday which specifically focused on the so-called scandal surrounding a unnamed male BBC presenter. We're allowed to say that. And this began with revelations supposedly in the Sun newspaper centering on a young adult and sexual photos and money being exchanged. Now, that story has taken a bit of a turn, I would say. We'll come on to this partly because you could argue there was a public interest element to that story, which is that it is illegal to receive sexual images from someone under the age of 18 in Britain, 16 and 17-year-olds. Those allegations that contact began at the age of 17. The Sun are rowing back on that. And I think this just goes to show how dangerous a narrative has been woven over this. There have been other supposed revelations by the BBC and the Sun newspaper. Now, just a word of warning or disclaimer. We cannot properly talk about the proper context of what we're talking about. That's because we can't reveal the identity of the person at the center of this. That does make this complicated to talk about. But I do think it's important to talk about because it is, as things stand, the most discussed news story in the country. And I think it tells us a lot about our media ecosystem. Do we really trust the Sun newspaper as the moral arbiter of the nation? A newspaper which itself published pictures of 16 and 17-year-old girls nude not that long ago within living memory. The sorts of images which, if you had on your hard drive now, could make you liable to have committed a serious sexual offence with a custodial sentence. Just worth discussing that. But I think this just goes to show, with those elements we can talk about, the way the Sun have approached this story, the way it's being discussed, and what that means in terms of our media ecosystem. I think there's quite an interesting story. I know lots of people, when I did this video yesterday, people were saying, this is a distraction. There's lots of other things going on in the world. There's always lots of different issues going on in the world. Obviously, the world is on fire, as you probably noticed. But I do think this is important to talk about. Now, we're going to have a show today. We're going to go on only about half an hour, just for work reasons. But we've got a lot to discuss. So if you're watching live, as ever, do press like and subscribe. Or if you're not watching live, you can still press like and subscribe. I've realised either way. But if you're watching on Facebook, if you want to click through the YouTube link, that's always helpful. If you're listening on the podcast, as ever, hello. And you can support us on patreon.com/SomeJoes84 to keep the show on the road. Now, I'm just going to bring in our guest because we only have till about past. I'm going to bring in brilliant Francesca Cociani. I should have asked you that before we came on air, actually. Have I got that right, Francesca Cociani?
You did, Owen.
Yes. Thank you very much. Francesca Cociani is a brilliant legal brain solicitor at the legal firm. Sorry, I should have remembered this. I should have written this down.
Hodge Jones Allen.
That's the one. Great. And you focus on a whole range of very, very relevant issues to do, including people who have committed, for example, sexual offences. You're a criminal defence lawyer. You represent, as I said, people from all sorts of crimes. So that's very, very important. And we've got Nathan Sparks, who's the CEO of Hacked Off. Many people will be aware, obviously, at the forefront of campaigning for media reform with our tawdry and often, frankly, disgusting media ecosystem, with most newspapers in this country playthings of oligarchs and all the terrible problems that arise from that. So campaigning very much for media reform, which is challenging in itself because we have a media ecosystem which has a stranglehold over the means of information, less so than it used to, but nonetheless still challenging. But Hacked Off do a brilliant job. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining me. I just want to start, actually. I've got a clip here from John Sopel on the Newsagents podcast. And John Sopel is a former BBC journalist and therefore a former colleague of the presenter at the centre of this. Let's just hear from John Sopel.
Surely the onus has to be on the Sun now. Well, put up or shut up. Show us what you've got. Because at the moment, all we had in the Sun last night, after the youngster had made this statement through the lawyer, was the parents saying, well, we stick by our story.
And Tim Davie, the Director General, loathed to criticise the Sun. I thought that was interesting. Does not think that that's his job or his duty. You ask the questions to them. I'll just carry on talking about
Surely
processes.
the Sun has to come up and say, OK, Here are the bank statements. Here is the proof. This is why we are absolutely confident of our ground that we stand on. If you are in any newsroom, the first thing your editor is, when you go with a story, you say, have you stood this up?
Now, I should say, by the way, for those watching, can you super chat to put questions to guests? I will read out at the end everyone who's put questions. Just on that, what he just said there in terms of the evidence. Now, one, which has been raised by David Yellen, the former editor of The Sun, is the lack, for example, of evidence that The Sun have seen the actual evidence itself, whether that be the so-called dossier, whether it be bank statements showing money. There's also the fact this is reported by Jim Waterson, media editor of The Guardian, my colleague. Source of The Sun moved to try to distance the newspaper from any suggestion the BBC presenter received photographs when the individual was a child. What we're talking about there is under the age of 18. So 16 and 17 is different from the age of consent, which might be a criminal matter. They claim the story published on Friday night was always really about concerned parents trying to stop payments to their vulnerable drug-using 20-year-old and was never really meant to be about the age of the alleged victim. Francesca, just from a legal perspective, I'm just interested in that point, because I would say if a BBC presenter was receiving images of a sexual nature from a 17-year-old, that would be a public interest to report that. That's illegal. That's criminal activity. But if they're walking back on that, what do you think? Just with whatever hat on, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, if they're walking back on that, and it actually turns out that this presenter never had the sexual images of a 17-year-old, well, then I think it's hard to see what the criminal offence would have been. Sexual communications with a child is a criminal offence, but the age for that is under 16. And so if there are no images being taken or sent or distributed of somebody who is under the age of 18, then I would struggle to see what the criminal offence is.
I mean, Nathan, just in terms of the evidence, I mean, this is a point which it's also been made by other reporters. I think a Sky presenter went through each day of the Sun's reporting, and they couldn't find any evidence that the Sun themselves had seen other than the testimony of the mother and then the stepfather, who just appeared, by the way. Oh, we've lost Nathan's vanished. We'll carry on talking then legally, Francesca, about this. Just in terms of then, I mean, in terms of, public opinion, I get a trial of public opinion. There's no trial at the moment. No one's been charged. No one's been arrested. The Metropolitan, what we were told, and this was another revelation, in Monday or Tuesday's Sun newspaper, is a stepfather who suddenly appeared. He wasn't in the coverage beforehand. The stepfather said, we approached the police, but they told us nothing illegal had happened, and therefore there was nothing we could do, which is why they said they went to the BBC and then the Sun newspaper in order to... So, sorry, Nathan, we'll come back to you. You're back. Great to see you there. So what do you think about that, Francesca? The fact that they approached the police... but nonetheless, we've got a trial as though he's been put on trial by the media, but the police haven't even launched a criminal investigation.
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps we should differentiate what we're actually talking about here. Are we having a trial in terms of, are we trying to establish whether this presenter has committed a criminal offence or not? And are we allowing the media and the public to try him for this? Or do we want to have a conversation as a society as to whether, it's morally acceptable for a prominent BBC presenter in his, 50s or 60s or whatever to be exchanging sexual images with an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old? I think these are separate conversations. But I think it would be important if the family is satisfied, or the Sun is satisfied, that no criminal offence has been made, for that clarification to be made clear. And then we can sort of move on and have these sort of more moralistic type discussions. But things have been quite blurry here. We're sort of asking the Sun and the public to throw in their opinion as to whether it's criminal or not criminal, whilst actually, this person's not even been arrested. And yes, the police appears to have said that there was no criminal offence.
I mean, Nathan, in terms of the media ethics here, or just journalistic integrity and journalistic standards, if a reporter in a newsroom that's functioning properly, wishes to publish a story, then an editor who has integrity will say, can you stand it up? And that means providing sufficient evidence to back up serious allegations. Now, amongst the first allegations was of sexual images involving a 17-year-old, which the Sun have now walked back. But also the fact that there doesn't seem to be clarity on whether the Sun have actually seen any evidence. Where do you think, in terms of just from journalistic standards, what does that mean?
Yeah, so I think the very first thing that a responsible publisher would do when confronted with this story is speak to the individual who's at the heart of it, who the Sun is presenting as the victim here, the person who's exchanged the images, and engage with them and understand what their position is. And from then you would hope to get hold of the evidence that you need to stand up the story and so on. We only find out later, because the Sun doesn't admit this at the time, and we don't know for sure that the Sun knew that this individual didn't actually support the allegations, but this individual claims that they wrote to the Sun, their lawyer wrote to the Sun earlier in the week and said that they don't agree with the allegations that their parents are making, their estranged parents are making. The Sun don't admit any of this, so we only learn later that actually the allegations aren't supported by the central character in the whole story, and that throws the whole thing into doubt. And the Sun, at the very, very least, and I don't think it should have reported this story in this way at all, but at the very least, if it was going to go ahead with a story like this, it really needed to make clear that the person at the centre of it disagreed and thought it was rubbish. And I just want to make a second point that just following on something that Fran was touching on, which is that when you publish a story like this, you create and you feed a kind of social media frenzy about who the presenter and the person that's responsible, who's involved actually is. So the test, the threshold in terms of kind of the public interest in this story must be really strong. You have to be really confident that you've got a really robust public interest defense when you publish something which might well destroy someone's life and possibly destroy two people's lives, because there's the individual at the heart of it as well. It seems very clear to us that the Sun was not in a position to make that judgment on the basis of the very limited evidence that it had available to it.
I mean, I have to say, from a journalistic perspective, the claim which was made through a solicitor that there was an attempt by the 20-year-old man. I mean, this is the other thing. We keep having things like child thrown around, which, you know, it obviously everyone, you could be a 50-year-old and someone's child. But when people use the word child, they instantly think infant. They think of someone who is under the age of 16. We're talking about a 20-year-old young man at the moment. But the fact that not young man, young person, very clear. We don't know the gender of any of the individuals. Young adults. So we're talking about not a 15-year-old, a 20-year-old young adult. But the fact the Sun didn't, that they were supposed to have contacted the Sun newspaper, and then the Sun denying all the allegations on Friday. How is it, just from a journalist perspective, possible the Sun didn't think they could get away with saying this is denied by the young adult at the centre of these allegations? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, fundamentally, it's because the Sun's not regulated. So as long as they manage to avoid breaking any explicit laws, as they have done, it seems in this case, then they can pretty much write whatever they like. And that's why we as Hacked Off campaign for all newspapers to be independently regulated, so that in circumstances like this, you can have an investigation after the fact and explore whether people's privacy and so on has been breached in ways that might not be unlawful, but are still unethical and are wrong.
I mean, Francesca, just in terms of the, for example, we can't prejudge the outcome of any of this. We don't know what's going to happen, who's going to come forward, where this is going to go. Who knows what will happen? Because at the moment, they're trying to have rolling coverage of other, it must be said, young adults, which I'll come on to. But if wrongdoing has taken place of an illegal nature, which has not happened so far, we don't have any clarity of that. But would this undermine the possibility of a fair trial?
Well, I think it would make, the more you sort of start speculating publicly about what the evidence is, who is guilty, who is not guilty, who is a party to it, and who isn't, like the higher the risk of having a fair trial is jeopardized with. Now, of course, any proceedings of somebody in the public interest will attract sort of journalistic scrutiny and public attention. But there is a real risk that if we sort of start speculating at this stage, or, even asking, for instance, the Sun, they should be publishing the bank accounts, they should be publishing the messages, etc. This is, these are normally questions of fact for a court to establish. Normally there's 12 people who sit in a jury, not 60 or so million, without having gone through any sort of due process in terms of what evidence are you allowed to see, what evidence are you not allowed to see, etc. So yeah, I think that there is a risk that the more we talk about it without measure, before there's even an arrest or an investigation, the harder it will be for any accused person to have a fair trial.
I mean, just on some of the latest so-called revelations, the BBC themselves published a story, which, by the way, was suggested by John Sopel, a former BBC journalist, an investigation which could have predated the Sun's own story in terms of when that investigation took place, which is interesting, which might be why some say the Sun have rushed this out, because they fear that they were trying to get ahead of other outlets. But this was BBC presenter sent abusive and menacing messages to second young person. Now, in this case, what we're talking about is someone in their early 20s who met this person through a dating app. They exchanged numbers, and then this individual, the younger person, suggested they were going to. They posted on social media. Depends what word you want to use, threatening or suggesting they were going to post the identity of the BBC presenter, and that they were to then send abusive messages. Now, again, I mean, there is a law, isn't there, Francesca, on the Offensive Communications Act or something. You can't send you can break the law by sending certain messages. But again, the context is just legally, again, it's hinting at a certain direction, which is stricter context.
Yeah, I mean, or it could be, I don't know. We haven't seen the messages, but I suppose, it could amount to harassment. I think there were suggestions that some of the messages contained sort of threats to the second person who came forward, so I suppose that there's another offence, harassment with violence. But again, it's hard to say without actually knowing what they say. And it's not really a matter for the public to judge on.
I mean, Nathan, on that. Yeah, sorry, go on.
No, just without any sort of kind of structured proceedings or investigations preceding that.
I mean, Nathan, on that, I mean, it almost looks like the BBC imitating tabloid forms of journalism, but about one of their own presenters.
Yes. Well, I mean, what I would say is that one can draw a contrast between the way the BBC covered this and the way the Sun covered this. So, first of all, they've spoken to the person at the centre of the story who endorses the coverage, presumably, and feels a certain way about it, right? So that's number one. Number two, they've taken additional steps to avoid identifying the individual by not referring to their exact age or their family situation or anything like that. And number three, in this case, the BBC has said it has seen the messages and it has direct access to them, and we can be fairly confident of that because it's in touch with the person at the centre of it. So I think actually you can draw quite a strong contrast between the way that the Sun handled allegations, which was essentially kind of second or third hand information from estranged parents of a grown adult. You can contrast that with the way the BBC has handled it by going directly to an individual. And also, I would say that the case for the public interest is, on the surface of it, is I think potentially much stronger in the BBC story as well. Because if it is the case that these messages were threatening or abusive, that's unequivocally unethical in a way that may not apply, and we still don't fully know, but may not apply in respect to the Sun story.
Though it should be said, in terms of context, we need to know the nature of the individual threatening to expose the identity potentially of the individual online, and what that actually meant in terms of, we don't know what the message is in response for that. But that context, again, that is an important context. I mean, in terms of the latest story, again, this is in the Sun today, which is BBC star broke lockdown to meet another young stranger. Again, I mean, it's trying to push people. People say young, people hear young. What do they mean there? That was a 23-year-old who is now 25, 26. Again, it's just the constant use of words like young person. I mean, that's a young adult. But that is an adult. That's someone who could be 20, people at the age of 23 can have families and be settled down. But and again, there's it is illegal to break lockdown rules. I don't think the Sun have a strong position on that, given they had an illegal Christmas party in 2020, which was quite raucous and defended Boris Johnson anyway. But it's just, again, these messages, because it was said, putting under pressure to meet, and you read them, it's like the presenter asked, did you say next week not good for you? The youngster replied, no, I'm good for next week. I thought you didn't want to come because of restrictions. Again, it's just the sense constantly of, it's making it look like predatory older person and younger person who is vulnerable and being exploited, when actually that's someone who met them on a dating app and again exchanged telephone numbers and agreed to meet. And there was no suggestion of any sexual activity or even hints of sexual activity. It's quite striking if you read through what the Sun said. Sex doesn't come into it at all. They don't even talk about it. There's no suggestion this presenter even talked about sex. But again, isn't this the problem? It's conflating different things. We start with a suggestion of illegality, a 17-year-old, sexual images. The Sun have now walked back on that. And it looks like now they're just trying to throw anything at the wall. They're trying to say, we've opened our doors to anyone who has had any contact with this person, and we will we'll just throw it in with things which are very, very different, when actually that is just consenting activity between two adults.
Yeah, and I would add just a couple of extra points to that. And first of all, you said at the start of this show, I think some people say this story might seem like a bit of a distraction. And maybe it is a distraction, and maybe you have to ask yourself, when the Sun publish a series of front page articles on what in some ways is quite a seemingly poorly substantiated story, what are they trying to keep off their front pages? And I don't think it may not be much of a coincidence that this is the same week that Boris Johnson has failed to hand in his phone and so on as well. So that's one point I'd make. And then secondly, the Sun, as you say, is just guilty of the worst kind of hypocrisy, attacking people over breaching COVID regulations. It was only in 21, I think, that their deputy editor, when he was leaving 10 Downing Street, a well-worn career path from number 10 Director of Communications to a tabloid newspaper, when he was leaving, they had a huge lockdown busting party in his honour, which the Sun then failed to report on. So regardless of the merits of the story in itself, they're an extremely shaky ground, sort of self-righteously making these proclamations.
I mean, Francesca, in terms of, firstly, just the Sun's hypocrisy, we just mentioned one element, but the other is that they published sexual images of underage girls. That is girls who are under the age of 18.
Yes, absolutely.
Just on that legally, if for example, if someone had on their hard drive the equivalent sorts of images as those that were published on page 3 in not that not longer period. So a 17-year-old with the sorts of images that the Sun published, could that be a criminal offence?
Yeah, absolutely. That's possession of indecent images of a child. So if the prosecution can prove beyond reasonable doubt that you had those images in your hard drive, that you knew they were there, and that they are indecent images, you are guilty of a criminal offence.
So the Sun have literally published within living memory. When I say living memory, we're talking not that long ago, within all of our lifetimes, they have published images on page 3 in a newspaper, which at the time was being read by several million people every single day. Those images would now be illegal.
They would be, and being in possession of those alone, the maximum sentence is 5 years in prison.
Astonishing, isn't it? Absolutely astonishing. Now, a lot of people, look, what we've done here throughout this is try to just preserve, we've skirted round where everyone can see what we're doing. Everyone can hear what we're doing. We're trying to talk about a topic where we may know lots of various things about the issue at hand, but we can't talk about it openly. Now, some will say, well, shouldn't the presenter just be named? Wouldn't that, what is and so I mean, I suppose Francesca, some would say, what's the main obstacle there? Because some arguments have come across, which is it's about privacy laws have become too suffocating. That we saw the case of Cliff Richard, where the BBC sent a helicopter when actually it turned out Cliff Richard wasn't guilty of anything. But it's gone too far now, and this is protecting people when their identity should be revealed. What do you think about that?
There is a convention right protected by the European Court of Human Rights and codified in our domestic law. Everyone has a right to a family and private life. Of course, that's a codified right, so it can be interfered with when necessary. And then, of course, everyone has a right of freedom of information, access to information, and freedom of speech. Now, these rights, they have to be balanced when there is in different circumstances. And so, what I would say to that is that actually criminal proceedings, they are open proceedings. Anyone can go to a court of law. You can sit in the Old Bailey every day, and just watch most criminal trials. You can go online and look at the court lists, and you can see who's in court tomorrow and what for. So, it's not like privacy laws are suffocating to a point where the public is completely kept in the dark as to who is being prosecuted and what for. But there has to be a consideration as to, where in the proceedings are we at, and what does the state actually have against you when, your reputation is at risk. And something so serious as an allegation like this, it can really destroy someone's life. And you can argue whether it's right for that to happen or not once, there's actual evidence against you, and once the authorities have confirmed that you have a case to answer. But when this individual hasn't even been arrested, is it right? Is it right for your reputation to be essentially destroyed at this stage?
I mean, on that, just if you've got any thoughts on this, and I'll put to both of you a couple of questions here. David Barata, will the Sun and News Corp face any legal consequences for this? If so, from whom, and how bad could it be? I mean, do you think there is any possible, Francesca, of this rebounding legally on the Sun newspaper?
Well, I'm not a defamation lawyer, and I'm not a privacy lawyer, so unfortunately, I can't comment on that.
So, what do you think, Nathan? Yeah, sorry, go on.
I think it's immensely unlikely on the basis of what we've seen so far. But I'm not legally qualified at all, so I'm even less qualified to comment on it. But a couple of things that I would just add on Fran's points, which is as I think Fran said, as soon as someone is charged, then they can be named anyway. So there's this kind of idea that people can never be named and they can go on committing terrible crimes and no one hears about them. Is not true. And secondly, we have to think about the alternative. The alternative isn't that everyone under suspicion is always identified by the press. The alternative is that people are identified at the discretion of newspapers. So people who have been accused of being involved in illegal practices at newspapers, of which there are many, those people don't get named and those people don't get identified in the press. Other people that newspapers and editors think should be named, they do get named. So you get a very kind of corrupted view of justice.
The other question from Tad Campbell: if there was no merit to the story, will it just go away eventually when the Sun has no more information to bring forward? Sorry, there's a bit of... Hold on, I'm just going to mute, see what's happening there. There's just a bit of echo going on. So, yeah, will it just go away? I mean, is it possible, do you think, that the presenter could never be named, for example, and this just disappears? If nothing illegal comes to the fore, this story, the presenter is never named, this just vanishes. What do you think, Nathan?
It's conceivably true, I suppose, but you're depending on the Sun giving up, and I'm not sure it will. Because it's using this, I suspect it is using this story as a proxy attack on the BBC, and it's been relentless with it for the last few days. And it's just a question of how long they are prepared to keep going on it.
Francesca, because I know the Wi-Fi is fighting a rearguard battle against you. I don't know if you can hear us, Francesca. Can you hear us, Francesca?
I can do, yes. I'm sorry. I think my...
No, it's all right. It's all right. We've got to see if I can get one last question to you before it collapses entirely. That does seem to have frozen.
Wi-Fi.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Francesca, if you can hear us. Do you think there's any, legally speaking, if nothing illegal is found to have happened, does that mean this story could just vanish completely? The police say there's no criminal investigation, and then you just end up with this curious limbo where you've had a series of accusations, no one's been named, but then nothing happens. Oh, I think we might have lost Francesca there, which is a shame. I mean, Francesca said some lots of very, very important things, and having suffered terrible attacks from Wi-Fi, I understand how annoying that is when you're on the receiving end. Yeah, just to end then, Nathan, what do you think in terms of the campaign for media reform? Where does this leave us? What do you think the kind of asks, or what kind of if you're a campaign for media reform in this country, what are the key demands that come out of this saga?
Well, I think it underlines just the need for independent regulation across the press. So we've heard a lot of criticisms of the BBC over the last few days, and I'm sure they've not dealt with it perfectly. But they are independently regulated, so they are accountable, and they're Ofcom and the BBC board and so on. There's systems in place to make sure that this is properly investigated and people are held to account where something's gone wrong. There is no equivalent system for most national newspapers, including The Sun. And that's how you end up with coverage like this. And it was really a reckless piece, I think, to publish. And it's just worth remembering that when we kind of abandon journalistic standards and standing stories up properly, we get situations like The Sun have done before. We get situations like their coverage of the Hillsborough disaster, where they libelled an entire city on the basis of really poorly substantiated evidence. And many would say they deliberately picked that evidence to cultivate that narrative. And there's a real risk that when we don't have robust standards, that kind of coverage repeats itself.
Yeah, I think that is itself a very important point to end on, frankly, in terms of what is a Tawdry saga, which I do think will go on, because I think what's happened is The Sun have decided that their reputation's now at stake. They've gunned for a presenter. Their initial story is looking shaky, and now they just want absolutely anything to make sure they get their scalp. Even if they don't have the evidence yet, they're hoping that something will come up, and therefore we'll get rolling coverage, maybe a headline every day based on whatever revelation they think they can dig up to make it stick. Thank you to Francesca, sadly frozen there, but brilliant stuff from Francesca, and also from Nathan. Really, really thoughtful stuff, and I learned a lot myself. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening.
Great stuff. Yeah, again, lots of people, I know people say, why, lots of things going on at the moment. Dead cat, is this a dead cat? It could well be. Maybe they've been storing up. I think what's more likely is, in this particular case, that there were different media outlets trying to potentially substantiate this, or who knows, maybe the mother and the stepfather were running out of patience and suggested they'd go to another newspaper, and The Sun rushed it out. They rushed it out without a strong enough body of evidence to support it. But I will see how this develops, because I think with more context, it would be easier to talk about what we're actually dealing with here. Because I am disturbed by this story, really, really disturbed. And I think we'll see how it develops. There could be more revelations. We don't know. I'm not going to prejudge how this ends. We don't know if it turns out there have been some form of wrongdoing of some description. It's also true that illegal and correct or right behavior, they're not one and the same thing. You can do things in your life which are not illegal, but which you end up losing your job over. We don't know, but I think it is important that we cannot have this trial by media where someone's entire life could be torn apart with shaky evidence. And I think a kind of witch hunt led by the Sun newspaper, which is a cesspit, not the moral guardian of the nation. I think it is something which we need to reflect on. But we'll talk about it I'm sure we'll talk about it more as we'll see how the story develops. But obviously, there's lots of other things which we'll be talking about in the coming days and weeks. So do hit like and subscribe. Sorry, it's a shorter show today. I've just got to do some work. Thanks to David Barata and Tad Campbell for super chats. Yes, do press like and subscribe. And I will do the show keep doing it every Friday. Friday? It's not Friday, is it? Wednesday. At 5 p.m. I am doing I'm doing Good Morning Britain as things stand next Monday and Tuesday. So do tune in for that if you're around. I've been enjoying doing Good Morning Britain. I know some people are a bit like, oh, they're all kind of trying to shut you up. Well, I've been doing this for 12 years. I'm used to that by now. It's kind of just see it as inbuilt as part of the job. But I hope I'm doing my best to raise issues with a broad audience, which are important, even if they're controversial and even if it means getting shouted down a bit. I'm tougher than I look, low bar. Do press like, subscribe, and also listen to the podcast. Thanks to two brilliant guests. I'll see you all very soon.